All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Kron, and I'm BPOC's Digital Operations and Collections Information Analyst. I also host and facilitate our webinar series. Here with me today, we have BPOC CEO Nick Honeysett and Consulting Executive Advisor Neal Stimler as my co-hosts. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to the second episode of Dreaming of Digital Asset Management. Last episode, we heard from DAM consultants and educators about their work in DAM and DAM education. In today's episode, we have invited Rachel Jacobson, Digital Assets Librarian at the Phillips Collection, and Hailey Majewski, Digital Asset Developer at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, to share with us their work managing digital assets without a traditional digital asset management system. Now, before I introduce our guest speakers, I'd like to mention that we will open our discussion up for Q&A at the end of the presentations. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A section. Feel free to comment and discuss in the chat as well. Today's session, as you know, is being recorded, and if you have any difficulty with the transcription service, please let me know. Now, for our speakers. Here we have Hailey. She has been digitizing museum specimens since 2015, from specimen data to images, from images to 3D renders. She now manages the storage and distribution of digital assets from across 13 collections, with the goal of making over 5 million objects accessible to the general public for the very first time. We also have Rachel here, who is the first full-time archivist at the Phillips Collection, a mid-sized art museum in Washington, D.C. She was brought on to stand up the first archival digitization project for the museum's library and archive. Rachel is from outside Washington, D.C., but has done projects in Amman, Jordan, Honolulu, Hawaii, and the less exotic suburbs of Baltimore. Her background is in archaeology and public history. She received a master's degree in public history from North Carolina State University in 2016, where she first worked as a processing archivist and has pursued an archival career since. Her gateway into digital asset management was as a garden history and design fellow for the Smithsonian Gardens, where she worked with born digital images of gardens in the archives of American gardens and digitized letters and photographs from a 1920s letter writing competition for burpee seeds. Rachel has pursued the digital side of archives because generally digital heritage projects support improved access through allowing audiences to connect with material remotely and usually without burdensome financial barriers. Thank you both for being here today. As you both already know, I'm so excited for your presentations and for you to talk about your work. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Hailey for her presentation.
All right, let me share my screen really quick. All right, so as Alex introduced me, so I am the digital asset developer at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. And I learned long ago that I cannot talk about my title without also going into a little bit of description of what I actually do. So I have active involvement in ongoing collections digitization and data publication. I train collections personnel and offer active help desk support on collections databases. I oversee the creation of 3D assets using structured light scanning with hopes to expand into photogrammetry in the future. I collaborate with research and collections, education, exhibits, marketing, and more on ways to integrate digital assets into current and upcoming programming. I consult on institutional policies regarding digital assets and digital strategy, and I monitor requests for loans. And that has just been the past 2 years of my life. The first 4 that I spent at the museum was actually as a digitization technician, and my approach to digital asset management is heavily influenced by that time. So first, let me go into a little bit of where collections digitization stood prior to 2015. So to give you an idea, we have 13 collections at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and there was really no standard for digitization across any of these. They were stored in inconsistent file formats. Some of them were in Excel, others in FileMaker Pro, Microsoft Access, Phoenix, Specify. Some of them were actually not digitized at all. And none of our data sets were available online. They were strictly internal with data only available to researchers upon request or by visiting the actual institution. And to give you an idea of the lack of standard in the digitization part of it, one collection actually had 38 separate databases, and much of it contained duplicate information. So in 2014, we received a National Science Foundation grant as part of the thematic collections network called Invert eBase, which was a group of 7 institutions digitizing their insect and mollusk collections for the very first time. So in 2014, we actually got this grant, and we only ever had one previous attempt at computerizing our collections. It was incomplete, and due to the lack of data backups and the loss of hardware, this now only exists as printed copies in archives. So when we started this, we started from the ground up. Between 2015 and 2020, we digitized over 136,000 insects, and that is over half of our pinned insect collection. And digitization comes in many flavors. We predominantly prioritize the transcription of label data, and we did this by taking low resolution imaging of the actual labels and use those to transcribe and then publish the data sets online. Although, as you can see, we did also do a lot of high resolution imaging in the meantime. And then personnel that actually worked on this project included 3 staff members, 2 graduate students, 14 work study students, 3 student interns, and 31 volunteers. So for those 5 years, we had a veritable army of people working on this. And at the end of this grant, in December of 2020, we actually migrated all of this data into our institutional specified database, which I will talk a little bit about specify in the future. But this time on this grant actually taught me a lot. And as I became a permanent staff member, I brought all of these lessons with me. And you can view the collection down below at that QR code that will take you to our GBIF thing, so you can browse the actual insects that have been published. The very first thing that I learned is that the end product should be a part of any discussion before digitization even begins. You need to know if you are sharing your assets and if you are sharing them, in what format you are sharing them, because that will save you a lot of work in the meantime at the end of it, when you realize that you do want to actually share it in the future. And that being said, I also strongly believe that assets should be shared and not just filed away. If you are not sharing your digital assets, are you really digitizing your collections? And that also gives us a lot of, helps us make our collections accessible as well. So it brings more value to our institution by the way of research and also more assets being created. Digitization has also allowed us to incorporate more of our actual specimens into exhibitry, programming, and the general public outreach. So that also increases the scope of it to the general public as well. We also found out that an institutional standard for data management and sharing is really crucial to the long-term success of any digitization project. We need a robust internal network to make sure that we are safely storing our digital assets that are created through digitization. So again, if you can't access your files regularly, are you really digitizing it? And that last one is my personal motto that came out of that, and that is error prevention is better than error correction. So it has taken a lot of work to get to where we are, but I wanted to showcase a little bit of the policies that we have either recently implemented or are hoping to implement in the future. So in terms of data storage, we are transitioning into virtual servers with the eventual goal of having our public-facing servers migrated into the cloud. We are integrating our collections assets into Specify. Data storage is intricately linked with if it will be shared and how. And we are actively working with our archivist to look into the best ways to actually store things digitally in the future. We have standardized IT equipment, and we have started using cloud-based applications such as Google Drive or Office 365 to promote easier access and day-to-day work, which really increases collaboration in your team. And we also have started centralizing IT digital storage under the same servers with standardized databases. We have offboarding procedures, which now allows us to make sure that work is no longer lost when an individual leaves the institution, which is important to allowing others to continue their work after they leave. And we are working now to have our data shared under the same Creative Commons designations. Specimen data, ideally, I would like to have it under CC0, which is no restrictions. We are also working to make our assets available for research in the general public, and also to make our assets viewable on the website. But as you can probably guess by what we have now, this was not always the case. So historically, we had very few actual standard policies for data management. So our backup servers were physical. They were not organized in easy or intuitive fashion. There was no monitoring of the data that was added on there to reduce redundancies or to promote ease of access, and many creative ways to get around the data stored policies. So for instance, formally, when a staff member would depart, their emails would be archived quite literally by printing off their entire mailbox, regardless of the context or value, and being filed into archives. We are working very hard to make sure that this is not going to be the case moving forward. IT was also traditionally not a centralized unit. So there was no standardization of equipment. Each department budgeted their own equipment, software, and databases. And by 2018, servers were still physical, and many of them were nearing or beyond the end of their lifespans. We also did not have any cloud-based backups or sharing tools, such as Office 365 or Google Drive. We also had no formal IT offboarding procedures until very recently, which meant that there were inconsistent backups and the data stored on work computers would not always be saved at their departure. So something like a CT scan of a fossil, which was on someone's personal computer because they lacked standardized equipment, was only found to not be in the museum's possession a couple years after that individual actually left. And there were no policies for the sharing of many of our digital assets, including no distinct language for newer forms of digital assets, such as CT and structured light scanning. Specimen data is shared under inconsistent Creative Commons designations, usually at the will of the API that they are published under. And data sets are not searchable via our own website. They still are currently not, but that is something I'm hoping to fix in the very, very soon near future. So a big push that we had was to migrate all of our collections into a single location with the same data standards with the goal of sharing our data. And as an institution, we decided to migrate this into Specify, which Specify is a MySQL-based database platform designed with biological research collections in mind. And it comes in two different flavors. There's Specify 6, which is the desktop application, and Specify 7, which is the cloud-based application that you can browse through the web. Both of these are open source. And these both have features, including an attachment server and a web portal, which what you're looking at here would be the web portal version of the specimen that you see on the left that will hopefully be browsable on our website in the future. But these are extremely useful features because this allows us to kind of use Specify as a digital asset management system. It's not quite, but it has some of that functionality. The attachment server allows us to attach images, PDFs, scans, 3D images, and more, as with the specimen, with localities, with accessions, expeditions, preparations. Basically, any part of Specify can have something attached to it for additional information. And not only that, but you can designate whether something will be marked as public or not. So you can choose as you load things in on whether it will be shareable via the web portal. And one of my long-term career goals is I want to work to integrate all of the archival materials linked with our collections to the actual specimens, which will allow us to access more information with less work and also eliminate those redundancies that we still currently see. So about a year ago, in April 2021, our institution actually acquired an Artex Space Spider, which is a structured light scanner, which allows you to create research grade surface scans of quite a majority of our collections. And so that sudden increase in the amount of data we were producing made us realize that we needed some short-term and long-term solutions. So in the short term, our projects are backed up on cloud storage, and long-term, I would like the final renders with their associated metadata loaded into Specify with the project files digitally archived. We are keeping the actual project files, which are the raw data, because that will allow us to potentially create new renders from the same data in the event that something happens to the final renders themselves. And in terms of sharing, that link will take you to our Sketchfab website, so you can view all of these online. We use that for exhibitry, for education, and general public access. And we are looking to increase our presence on MorphoSource, which is still in progress, for better accessibility to research. And both of these in the future will also be linked to their associated Specify specimen pages. So we are in the middle of celebrating our centennial, and we are, as an institution, are undergoing a vast transformation project, which will result in new exhibits, new educational approaches, and new ways to engage with the general public. Technology and accessibility are intimately tied into our vision of the future and to our strategic plan, which we published last year. And digitization of digital assets are actually tied into three of our four strategic goals: audience engagement, scientific leadership, and lifelong learning. And so all of these things will be very heavily incorporated into our future as well. Thank you. And here's my contact information if anyone would like to reach out with any questions.
Thank you, Hailey. I also put a copy of her presentation in the chat too for those who are interested. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to hear about her work at the Phillips Collection.
Great, thanks so much, Hailey. And before I get started, I'm assuming a lot of us are fellow museum people in the audience. So if you were looking at those historical policies and feeling like you're still there, you're not alone. That's definitely closer to where my museum currently is in terms of policies around digital asset management. We also had our centennial year in 2021. So it's definitely a challenging time to have a centennial year as a museum, but this definitely led to helping along the grant that I've been working on, the digitization grant, which I will talk about now. Just loading. All right, so my topic is also digital asset management without the system. I'm Rachel Jacobson at the Phillips Collection. I was hired through an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant. The grant was meant to start a digitization program for the archive, which I will talk about in a minute. So obviously, if you're attending this webinar series, you probably have at least a little bit of information about digital asset management systems, and especially if you attended episode 1, I'm sure you learned more about the different things that digital asset management systems can help with. I just wanted to briefly go over the major institutions that benefit most from digital asset management systems, and those are cultural institutions, corporate institutions, and higher education institutions. But I will be focusing on cultural institutions because I work at a mid-sized art museum. The Phillips Collection is a museum in DuPont Circle, and as I'm sure some of us can relate to, it has historically had a very skeletal staff within the library and archive. I'm the first full-time archivist at the Phillips Collection. Previously, there had only been a head librarian who actually retired this year. She did a lot of great work bringing bringing us to have a large book collection and a circulation system, but just historically it has been a skeletal staff down there, which is why the grants team worked so hard to get more people to help with this important project. So as I mentioned, I was hired through an Institute of Museum and Library Services grant. It was for a stewardship grant meant to build our capacity for digitization in the archives, which is why my title is Digital Assets Librarian, which is kind of a confusing title. Like Hailey, I feel like I have to actually explain what it is that a digital assets librarian does. And of course, it's organizing and preserving digital assets. However, when I was hired, it became kind of clear that there has been sort of a lack of institutional understanding of what a digital asset is and how we want to handle them. There hasn't been really a large effort toward making like a more centralized digital asset management policy. Every department is kind of handling things in their own, although we do have cloud backups of our most important digital assets, which include digital images of our art collection and now our digital images of our 3 collections that we digitized through this grant. But one thing that can happen when you don't have a clear understanding and good practice in terms of collecting digital assets is you end up having a much more robust historical narrative for an older time period, especially if the museum is 100 years old. We're just kind of lacking this more modern legacy because we haven't been actively collecting digital assets. There is of course many people at the museum who do realize that this needs to be a priority, which is why part of the grant was also, there was a dream of purchasing a digital asset management system through this grant. Of course, there was the option to select a small DAMS that could be used for the needs of this particular project. But I think that the goal really was to get an enterprise-wide or museum-wide digital asset management system and kind of using this grant as like a way to kind of achieve that goal. What I was able to explain was that this is a much loftier goal than what would be within the scope of this grant. So previous to the Phillips Collection, I had worked on the selection committee for National Geographic Society when they selected their digital asset management system. And they went through a really rigorous process, which I'm sure some of you in the audience are familiar with. So we had a large grid that it kind of explains like, what are the necessities, what would be nice to have, what's extra, and what's just not necessary for our needs. And we use this grid to analyze RFPs from several different vendors. The people who helped with this committee, they made sure to have somebody from every department in the selection committee. And that is because every department would have their own case studies. So even if you were just going to be using it to search within the DAMS and not actually contributing digital assets to the system, that's still a case study that's important to take into consideration. And so, if you want to do this correctly, we just figured this was maybe out of reach and that we would focus on more attainable goals. So what are those attainable goals? So our major deliverables are that we wanted to image 3 archival collections and we want to make those available to the public. And within this process, we want to make sure that this is replicable, whether or not, I'm at the museum or not, because as grant funding goes, I'm only a temporary employee, but if we can create this really great documentation, then ideally next time there's funding for another archivist or for a digitization project, we kind of have everything we need in place and we won't have to reinvent the wheel. So we went through several steps. We're now at step number 4, but I'm just going to revisit those briefly. So we had to kind of redetermine what our project goals were. As I mentioned, like getting the DAMS was actually going to be out of reach. So we wanted to make sure that we were meeting the grant criteria, which the the biggest goal is to really make this stuff accessible to people, and to make it so that we can do a project like this at the Phillips Collection again. So after we kind of went through the process of determining all of that, we then started to scope out the project. So as I mentioned, there are 3 collections. They're pretty different from each other. One is the Duncan Phillips correspondence, and that's the largest of the 3 collections, and it included material that was returned to the Phillips Collection from Archives of American Art. So that was kind of a whole other, thing of figuring out how to process that collection. One was the collection of Marjorie Phillips, which also required processing, and then there's an interesting historic photograph collection that also required processing. So just kind of figuring out like what is going on with these collections, what is the digital infrastructure in place at the Phillips Collection currently, where do we need to invest more in, and how are we going to achieve these goals with, again, a very skeletal staff. So then once we were kind of looking past the actual collections that into like the more infrastructural type of things, I also worked to hire a vendor and determine what technical specifications we would need for this contract with the vendor, figure out a timeline with them for getting things digitized and delivery options and things like that. So we've gotten through 1 through 3, and now we're at number 4, and we are trying to make this stuff accessible before the end of the grant. Because again, that is the main priority. And as Hailey said so nicely, what is the point of digitization if you're not sharing things? So initially we had sort of tried to go down an avenue of using the collections management system that was already in place at the museum in order to showcase our new digital objects. The reason I wanted to do it this way is that it was something that was already in place. So it was a sustainable choice in that regard, in terms of you didn't have to buy anything new or implement something new, which is a lot of work. And also I had actually used the collections management database at a previous job. And so I figured, okay, I don't need as much training on this. Like, let's just get this going. We will do it this way. The other reason that I felt that this would be a good option was that we were already using the collections management database to showcase our permanent collection on our website. So the collections management database is a metadata repository. It is not a digital asset repository, and we don't have a digital asset repository. But what we were doing with the permanent collection is using the metadata from the collections management system, and then tying and linking out to the drive, basically, to show like a digital surrogate of these images. So what ended up happening is we had to use a slightly different method because we were using larger files, more files, and also PDFs instead of just JPEGs. There also was an issue of just having a lack of IT support, which I'm assuming many of you can also relate to. We actually lost our chief information technology officer this year. She retired, and we had lost other staff within that department, and it's been a challenge to build that department back up. So I was trying to look for something else to do, with the main priority being that this would be replicable, regardless of, if I were stepping into to do another digitization project, or it was a different archivist. And so we decided to use archive space. Archive space had been something that I had decided that we would need in our library and archive previously, before wanting to use it for showcasing our new digitized images. And that was because we still don't really have it up to scale yet, but there was no centralized database or digital list or anything like that of like all the holdings in the archive. And so I figured that archive space would not just benefit this specific project through making more standardized and easier to search finding aids, but it would actually benefit the entire archive. So that was a main reason behind purchasing archive space. I'm still in the middle of implementing it. It's a lot of work, as I'm sure some of you know. But then we decided, okay, well, let's utilize this tool rather than kind of trying to fit a square into a circle or whatever the saying is. So we are hoping to have all of our digital objects displayed on archive space by the end of this grant. This is just a little like sneak peek. This is our sample digital object. This is actually a letter from the collection. So what we're hoping to have is this JPEG image that will show up in archive space. And then you can click on that image and it will direct you to the PDF. So we are going to be pulling URIs from the cloud and linking them to our archive space instance. I'm still struggling with how to do the digital objects ingest and make it work nicely, because you actually can't do any batch editing in archive space. So I'm just putting my email there in case anybody has any tips or wants to talk about digital objects in archive space. Please reach out, because I am trying to figure this out on my own and it is not easy. So again, we want to achieve the digital objects display in archive space by the end of the grant. Some of the hurdles, as I mentioned, the lack of support from IT, and then of course, COVID-19 created some issues, you know, for everybody, but also for this project. The reason that it kind of created some problems was that so we had decided that we would still stick to the timeline that we set out with the digitization vendor before the onset of COVID-19. And so in order to fulfill that, that obligation, we ended up having to start sending some of the archival collection over earlier than, well, so essentially it affected the amount of time that we had with the entire collection as a whole before we started sending batches of it to the digitization vendor. So I just think, you know, if I were to do this again, I would have liked to have a little bit more time with the collection as a whole before starting to send it out. Just for some context, I was hired in October of 2019, and we all were sent home in March, and then we still we're trying to start sending our material out to the vendor in August. So it's about 55 linear feet of just the Duncan Phillips correspondence. And so that's not a lot of time to be able to spend with the collection before sending it out the door to a digitization vendor. So the strategies have been, you know, really just focusing in on like how to make this stuff available in a short period of time. So I'm creating workflows from scratch. I'm also trying to make, you know, sustainable choices, since we may or may not have an archive or an archivist going forward. So those are the kinds of strategies I'm working on. I just also wanted to thank the community. You know, I say I'm doing this alone. I'm not doing this fully alone. The archivist community is so great and gracious. I've reached out to the Digital Library Federation Museum cohort quite a bit, and they've been really helpful. I've also talked with colleagues and just people that I know from other institutions, and it's been really helpful to have that, that support. So now that I've kind of gotten the project stuff out of the way, I thought I could share some product. So this is a letter from the Duncan Phillips correspondence. That collection is about 9,000 folders worth of material. It's about, as I mentioned, it's a 55 linear feet. The other two collections are much smaller. But I like this letter because it's a letter between the librarian of the DC Public Library and Duncan Phillips from 1932. And the librarian was asking to borrow a painting to show off in one of the public libraries. And the response was that he couldn't because there were no guards. And so then the letter goes on to explain like which libraries do have guards, because they do really want to borrow borrow some art. And so one of the libraries that is mentioned that does have guards is the Mount Pleasant Library, which this is actually a picture I found online of the Mount Pleasant Library from 1932. And this is what it looks like today. So that's kind of fun to see just like what's going on with the city. You kind of get a little bit of insight from some of his letters. And that collection spans from a few years before the museum was founded in 1921 up until his death in 1966. And so he worked as director up until his death, and then his wife, Marjorie Phillips, took over. This is a letter from Marjorie Phillips, the Marjorie Phillips correspondence. So she was the director. She was also an artist. So she was the director from 66 to 1972. And there was an issue where we were almost going to go over budget. We were able to remedy that because if we hadn't, actually the Marjorie Phillips collection would not have been digitized, which is a really important part of the grant, was to kind of get her stuff more out in the open, because there's a lot of times where people, so we always have a painting by Marjorie Phillips on display at the museum in her honor. And, you know, people will be like, oh, is she related to Duncan Phillips? Like, they won't even know who she is. So just kind of trying to build, you know, a more diverse picture of the legacy of the museum and talk more about these other people who really helped the foundational years of the museum, including Marjorie Phillips. So just to get a little taste of her personality, this letter is from 1968 and it's from the Louvre, and they want to borrow the Ballet Espagnol by Manet. And she's actually saying that, no, you cannot borrow that painting because it's really popular and we need to have it at the Phillips Collection. And that it's the only Manet in the collection, so we can't possibly do without it. Here is that painting, and it was acquired by the Phillips Collection in 1928. And then this is something from the photograph collection. So the historic photograph collection is kind of a funny collection. It's, I guess, going back to kind of not having like really strict policies in place. I don't know that it really makes sense to have all these photos together in a collection, but that's just how they are. And it made more sense to just digitize them all and have them all available to people rather than trying to like go back in and figure out like when certain things were accessioned into the collection and the provenance and whatnot. But so this collection actually spans from 1890 to 1999. And this is a photo that I really like. It's actually of Marjorie Phillips's family. And she's the one who's standing behind the chair. And I just like this because I feel like it shows a lot more personality than a lot of photographs from that time period. This is another photo that I like that's part of that collection. It's of the museum in the 1960s, because there's a big habit at the museum, and I think probably a lot of us can relate to this, like where you really only see the very beginning of the museum or the very modern day narrative of the museum. So I like this because the facade of the new building doesn't look anything like this anymore. And we kind of like forget that it ever did look like this. So yeah, I just like this photo as well. So thank you so much. I will say, hopefully going forward with this project, the goal is obviously to get these things online, but the reasoning behind that is because we're trying to really diversify our narrative and just make it so that the archive as a whole is just has more attention brought to it, and people are able to ask new questions about the history of the museum. And so that's really my main objective with this project, and also obviously so that we can digitize more stuff. So thanks again.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Hailey. I can't say enough how encouraging it is to learn in more detail about the steps institutions are taking to improve their processes. So really appreciate the both of you taking the time to share that with us today. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up the discussion for questions from the audience. We don't have any yet. So while we wait for questions to come in, I'd love to hear more from both of you about what it has been like working in a grant funded position, and then from you, Hailey, what it's been like to transition from that grant funded position to an employed position.
So grant funded stuff, or at least from my perspective, is definitely a lot more contained. So for me, working in one collection, I learned being able to focus in on all of that material for those 4 years I was there really did help me in the broad aspect of everything. What I find going from that to a permanent position, it's very interesting because I can't have that level of intimacy with the material that I'm working on anymore. But because I came from a collection that had no digitization whatsoever, it's kind of funny when collections managers will work with me and they'll apologize for the state of their databases. And I'll tell them, just the fact that you have anything at all is amazing to me because we didn't have that for 4 years.
Yeah, I would say that I think my museum is probably slightly smaller than the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. One of the issues that I do run into is like wanting to be involved with stuff that's outside of the grant, but not necessarily having like the amount of time to, give that my attention. But yeah, I agree, like the intimacy of specific collections is really nice. But yeah, sometimes feeling a little bit like you're pulled in different directions.
Thank you. We did actually get a couple questions in, so I'm going to read the first one off. Can either of you talk more about the decision to use open source software specified in archive space? Our IT department refuses to use anything open source because they think it'll be too intensive to set up and maintain / support. What has your experience been with the open source aspect of these platforms?
So at least in my experience, the decision to migrate to specify was actually predated my my permanent archive or my permanent position. So that was actually made before me. But a lot of what we had is because we already had 2 collections that were in specify. And because of just the extreme flexibility in what you can do with it. So every aspect of specify is editable in some way, shape, or form. So every single one of those fields that you could see, I could change, like make it do whatever I want to. It honestly is not intensive to set that up or maintain or support it. The biggest hurdle is getting the data ready to actually go into it.
Actually, sorry, I was just going to weigh in on the whole open source thing. I know Neal's probably itching to do that too. I think, the issue, we see this a lot with IT departments who are very reluctant to adopt an open source platform. And really the issue is the open source platform supported by either a selection of vendors? Sometimes it is an organization will take on the support of an open source platform. And that's really the key. I mean, Specify is open source, but there's an amazing community. It has an amazing installed base, significant installed base. So it has weight behind it. And so I think that's largely the conversation that you need to have with your IT department.
And just to respond to Nick's point there, it really depends on what's right for your institution. So if your collections are being designed and managed in a certain way and open source is a viable alternative, examine it carefully. And it might be the right thing for you. If there are other concerns from your IT department, but also from a governance or security standpoint, you can meet those 2 in different ways. So there's no one size fits system for every institution. It's really based on your budgets, your staffing models, your needs. So be flexible in your thinking.
Yeah, and our instance of archive space is actually hosted. So we're not doing any of the bug fixes or anything like that. I will say that actually a hosted version of archive space is a little bit of a challenge in a sense because you can't really do any database stuff. to it. Like you're actually pretty limited in what you can do, which, you know, is a good thing and a bad thing, I guess. It's good because you're not going to like risk screwing everything up. But it's bad because there's not a lot of flexibility. I would say like currently with everything else on my plate, I don't know that I could devote the amount of time that I would need to be able to do database editing and like batch editing, but it would be nice if that was more of an option with the hosted version of ArchivesSpace, which is hosted through Lyrasis.
Yeah, send us your IT manager's home phone number and we'll talk to them.
All right, so next question. This is for Hailey from Mark Osterman. I'm curious what some of the responsibilities of volunteers were in your project, what the recruitment, management, and training component looked like, and on average, how long volunteers remained on the project, and lastly, some broad demographics of who the volunteers were.
Excellent question. So some of the responsibilities that volunteers had, they did the majority of specimen handling. They did the imaging and the transcription. And then the final versions of the transcription, they would then send it to me to fact check everything and quality check everything. And then I would actually do the final push into publication. So recruitment, we usually had recruitment open pretty much consistently. And in terms of management and training, most of them reported to me. And I would have training for the specimen handling aspects. I would train them in the actual transcription aspects, like how to do all of these. And I actually monitored them on a day-to-day basis. So I would usually say the training, there would be like 1 or 2 intensive training sessions. And then for their first month they were here, I would monitor them more actively. And then as they got more comfortable with their roles, I would kind of let them work more independently. We had, most of our volunteers usually worked at least 3 to 6 months. We actually have some volunteers who are still currently working in that lab that started at the same time as me. So we have many volunteers that have been there for at least 5 years at this point. So they actually did a vast majority of the active digitization. Many of them literally put those specimens on the map. Demographic wise, it was kind of a mix of a lot of things. Many of them were retired and wanted to work in a museum setting. And others were people at the beginning of their careers who are interested in getting more information and more experience in a museum setting, and a little bit of everything in between.
Thank you, Hailey. I think some really great questions today. Next one. So this is from Crystal. Can you talk a little about the documentation needs / process that you have to outline the process and that you have to outline the process and systems you use to build a sustainable solution in caring for these files? This is for both of you.
Yeah.
Well, so I've kind of been in the habit of like handling them individually and then hoping to like create kind of like a digital binder of everything. So like I have one document that's like how to make technical specifications and like what are the problems you might run into when doing that, or like, you know, resources on like how to you know, scope out a digitization vendor, like how to know when you want to do something on-site or off, digitize something on-site or off-site. And then I have like the digital preservation strategy. So yeah, just kind of like handling them piecemeal and then hoping to put them together. And one of the reasons that I've been doing it that way is just because it's, I'm not doing everything all at the same time. So like they're fresher in my mind at different times. And so, yeah, I'm hoping to just kind of like create a document that will point you to the direction of like, okay, well, now you're at the digital preservation side of things. So like, what do you want to do with that? Or, you know, you want to create a finding aid in ArchivesSpace. So like, look at this. And then when you're ready to do subjects in ArchivesSpace or digital objects in ArchivesSpace, there's this documentation. So yeah, just kind of like I think that's also just like the way my brain works, is like to take things step by step in order to not feel overwhelmed.
Honestly, that's exactly what we do as well. And you also have to practice every part of the documentation needs in the process before you're even able to write it down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, there's a lot of trial and error involved.
Yeah, I think having so we definitely did not have 31 volunteers on this project, but we have had a few volunteers, and having them like look over the workflows or whatever it is that I'm working on before like deciding that this is finalized has been really helpful too, because you want to just make sure that all of the documentation needs to be understood, not just by archivists, it needs to be understood by other people that work in the museum. And so you want to make sure that you're not using too much jargon or anything like that.
Great. All right. So we have the next question from Jennifer Mary. Can you talk about getting your entire staff / board on board with spending the money? We are struggling with bringing everyone together to agree that a digital asset management system is needed. We are also state-run and nonprofit, so funding is a hard topic. Sustainability is a question mark.
I was dreading a question like this because I actually do not have much experience in this. By the time I came in, most everyone was already on board with this. The only thing that I can really say is if you're struggling to find things internally, you need digital asset management.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You got to figure out what the return on the investment is, and you can capture that by doing some analysis on what's happening right now. And I think Hailey is exactly right. The amount of times we talk to institutions and they spend half a day to find one picture of that donor at the gala last year. That should take you a minute, and there should be no transaction or conversation with anyone to figure out where it is. There should be common understanding that there is this centralized system professionally managed by a domain expert, and everybody has access. I mean, that can be, if that's happening a lot, that's a significant amount of wastage that you can put an actual dollar value to.
And the other key thing to consider too is what missed opportunities do you have from other needs that you might have from a curatorial or education standpoint. So if you don't have the ability to basically find your core assets, how can you then augment or improve your data or your interpretation if you're still doing that essential discovery work? So every time that you're trying to find that asset, you're not actually fulfilling your mission to your fullest potential on the public side of things as well, because those educational programs, those curatorial essays, labels, conservation research is being undermined by the inability to produce in a more effective way.
I have another great question from Mark. Have you all dealt with the information / interpretive side of all of this related to object information? I'm speaking specifically to the lack of diversity and inclusion that often exists related to a lot of original research done on objects, and how the necessary work of new interpretation and things like conscious editing gets incorporated into the process of digitization and collections access.
Well, for my collection, we didn't do a whole lot of like culling. Like when I said that we were doing processing, it was really just putting things into folders, like according to the correspondence. So I do think we've tried to do our best to escape that. Obviously, we can't control like what Marjorie and Duncan deemed they wanted, deemed the need to save or whatever. But making it all available is hopefully going to kind of improve diversity in the collection and the types of questions that were asked about the museum or research that can be done on the museum, or even artists that have a relationship with the museum. As an example, like the letter that I shared about the library, the librarian was actually referencing a conversation that he had with a man named Selah Watkins, who is, you know, historically the reason that we have, the Phillips has a relationship with Howard University. And it's just, you know, he's just one of these many people who are just ignored because we spend a lot of time focusing on Duncan only and not the relationships that also existed between other staff members at the museum. So, I mean, that is like a pretty big goal of mine, to use these collections as a way to kind of get people to ask different questions than the ones that they're typically asking, and also to kind of show the personalities of the people who have been generally overlooked, because we do so much focus on Duncan Phillips.
We got another question just come in. Could you speak to the process of system integration when pivoting from multiple databases / collections / servers to a singular DAMS or metadata repository? Did any of the systems not integrate with one another?
Yes. Yes. One of the big struggles has been to try and get those databases into a way that is then editable and standardizable, that can then be fed into the new system. For what we do is, a lot of it has been extracting it into an Excel spreadsheet, spending many months or years editing it and standardizing the individual processes, and then migrating it in. We actually have at least 4 different collections who have spent the last at least 2 years currently working on doing these things. And there's still probably a lot of work that needs to go into it to get there. It's rough, but it's worth it in the end.
I can't really speak to this because we didn't have any systems in place. So everything is starting from scratch.
Right. Amanda Shields would like to know, for those that have moved to cloud storage, do you still have a 3rd copy saved offsite in a server? How have your long-term preservation strategies changed with cloud storage?
So I would say a lot of the digital preservation strategy that I've put together for the archive is mostly about like what we want to see going forward and not where we currently are. So right now we have two external hard drive copies of the material, and then we have so we have one cloud backup, which is like the legacy version of it because it has all of the deliverables from the digitization vendor, which includes individual JPEGs and TIFFs. But then we have the public bucket in our AWS, which is only the PDFs and the sample JPEGs that I showed as the example slide, because those are the ones that we're actually going to be directing people to in archive space. So obviously this is not ideal, but it is kind of the best thing we can do for now. And it is relatively safe because we do have, we technically have 4 copies of every piece that we want to make public. So yeah.
Yeah, we have at least 3 copies of everything. One of them is cloud-based. One of them is physically stored on either a computer or a server. And in terms of our collections database, I also keep an up-to-date copy of it on my person at all times. So it is actually on my keychain. And that helps at least keep all of that as much as possible.
Just to add on to that, if your institution's still having questions about making the move to the cloud, just think about all the risks for only on-premise solutions. So if there's a natural disaster, for example, some sort of water damage or a hurricane or something else that happens to your facility, something can be at risk. It can be at risk of theft. So someone walking away with your laptop server or hard drive. The issue too of the sustainability of the hardware itself. So given the fact that with technology company and change, with the different types of cables and devices and drivers that we all use, you're actually sort of living within the danger zone if you're not constantly migrating or hosting these things elsewhere, because you will come into contact with the day that when you try to plug in that hard drive, either you won't have the port, you won't have the cable, or the 2 devices won't be able to talk to each other. So there's a lot of risk in just the on-prem solution. So really be thinking about a much more holistic approach and working with your administration on the security aspect as well.
I would also like to just comment on in terms of the natural disasters, the Brazil National Museum's fire, which completely destroyed the entire museum. They lost everything. There is nothing left. Or there's probably some things left, but I guarantee you that most of it is gone. But if they'd had anything digitized or backed up, they would at least have some copy of a lot of that things left.
All right, we are at time. So many thanks again to you, Hailey and Rachel, for sharing your work with us today. And thank you everyone for attending. And for those who have asked such incredible, thoughtful questions. We will be back again next month on May 12th for episode 3, where we have invited several digital asset managers to share with us their work managing digital assets in a digital asset management system. We will be posting more information about this episode in the next few weeks. Please follow us on social media or sign up for our newsletter if you'd like to be kept informed of future webinars. I hope everyone has a great week and we will see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.